Support for this episode comes from Such a Match, a new podcast of Jewish love stories from Jay, the Jewish News of Northern California. If you enjoyed our miniseries on Jewish weddings, you'll love listening to Such a Match, where you'll hear stories from real couples who met and married after meeting the old-fashioned way, in a Jewish newspaper's personals ads back in the 90s and early 2000s. From stories about hilarious blind dates to moms who play matchmaker, you'll also get the real story about falling in love, navigating the highs and lows of marriage, and the truth about lasting love. You can listen to Such a Match wherever you get podcasts, beginning January 21st.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 465, Jewish Ritual Lab. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And our guest today needs no introduction, at least not for the long-term Judaism Unbound listeners, as she was the second ever guest on this podcast. But don't worry, if you haven't been listening since 2016, we will introduce her. Vanessa Ochs is one of the world's leading scholars of Jewish ritual and the author of what is probably the core book in this area. It's called Inventing Jewish Ritual. Today, we're going to get a little bit more practical about Jewish ritual. And if you're into today's conversation, you're going to be able to take an even deeper dive as Vanessa Ochs will be teaching a 3-session class in our Yeshiva Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning, which starts this coming Wednesday. Vanessa Ochs' class, which is called Jewish Ritual Lab, Experiments in Jewish Creativity and Invention, will explore ceremonial objects and creative rituals as a rich meeting point between artistic and Jewish practice. The 3 workshops in the class will explore the conditions and creators that have successfully introduced new objects and rituals into contemporary Jewish practice, and they'll consider what ritual objects tell us about the cultural and spiritual lives of diverse Jewish communities. Folks in the class will also generate and experiment with their own new rituals, which they can apply in their own Jewish lives during and after the class. This course starts in just a few days on January 15th, so head over to judaismunbound.com/classes to register. Financial aid is available for this class and for all other Yeshiva classes, and you can request financial aid through a simple form, which is linked to on every class's registration page. A few more words of introduction for Vanessa Ochs. She was our second ever guest on episode 5 of Judaism Unbound, which was entitled Leviticus, back in 2016. And returned to Judaism Unbound a few years later in episode 211 to discuss a book she wrote about the history of the Passover Haggadah. Vanessa Ochs has been one of the most important influences on this podcast, and we're thrilled to have her on again. When we've had her on before, Vanessa Ochs was professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. Now she is professor emeritus, and she was the Rabbi Sally Priesand visiting professor at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion last academic year. Vanessa Ochs is also a rabbi. In her research, she investigates new Jewish ritual, Jewish feminism, Jewish sensibilities, the Passover Haggadah, and Jewish material culture. Her research on new Jewish rituals has expanded to include practices that emerged during the COVID pandemic and responses to October 7th. Vanessa Ochs' books include The Passover Haggadah, a biography, Inventing Jewish Ritual, which won a 2007 National Jewish Book Award, The Jewish Dream Book with Elizabeth Ochs, Words on Fire, One Woman's Journey into the Sacred, and Safe and Sound, Protecting Your Child in an Unpredictable World. Vanessa Ochs was awarded a Creative Writing Fellowship by the National Endowment for the Arts. So let's get back into the subject of Jewish ritual. Vanessa Ochs, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you on again.
It's so good to be with you both again. Thank you.
Well, we've had you on the podcast since, but I want to pretend that we didn't and flash back to our original interview with you. And that was in this early time when we were trying to figure out, what does it look like to think differently about Judaism and specifically about Jewish ritual, because you literally wrote the book on that. And so I wanted to start by asking you if your thinking about Jewish ritual has changed in any significant way in the last decade since we had that conversation. What new ideas, what new thinking you've done? And if not, I was wondering if you could just kind of anchor us in your core thinking about Jewish ritual.
It hasn't really been a decade. That's extraordinary.
8.5.
No, only 8 years. Never mind. I've been thinking these last few years very specifically about the rituals of Jewish rituals of COVID and the rituals that have emerged after October 7th. And it's only recently that I've begun to think about how are those two sets of super brand new rituals different than the rituals that I had been focusing on initially that happened in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So primarily the rituals addressing feminism, addressing a more democratic Judaism. And when I look at all of those rituals together, what has struck me is that new Jewish rituals have work to do that would not get done necessarily if the rituals hadn't been innovated. So when I think of new rituals now, I'm thinking about what are the pressing needs out there that ritualists, ritual inventors, and clergy and everyday Jewish people, what do we need to address in this moment through our rituals to meet real and pressing needs? The rituals that emerged during COVID and the ones after October 7th seem so incredibly pressing, and they happened so very quickly. It was only days after COVID emerged that rabbis were generating new ways of performing Jewish rituals. We in our households were already thinking about, well, what do we do for Passover? And it was right after October 7th that we were thinking, well, gee, how are we going to do Hanukkah this year? How are we going to do Purim or Passover this year? These needs came immediately. And there was this kind of this supercharged effort to respond ritually. So I think that's something that's new that's happened, or at least new in my thinking, that we can race ahead in our innovation and that it's okay.
And do you think that there have been times in Jewish history, particular times where there's been that kind of openness or that kind of need, like a real, a traumatic incident like October 7th or COVID or the Holocaust or the destruction of the Second Temple or whatever it might have been, that creates this kind of profound openness to ritual change and to ritual invention? And there's almost a very fast, I'm thinking about like evolution, the dinosaurs are destroyed by the meteorite, and all of a sudden the mammals start evolving very fast because all these niches are open, but then it kind of slows down again very quickly? Or do you think that, taking COVID, for example, that energy has been sustained over time and is likely to sort of open a phase of ritual imagination that lasts longer than that?
Let me think backwards. Let's think about the rituals that emerged as a response to feminist critique of Judaism. I imagine someone looking back 100 years from now will say, well, that was quick. Women with kippot, women covering their heads, women wearing talitot, prayer shawls, women finding new ways of using the mikveh, the orange on the Seder plate. Well, that happened, lickety split very fast. But that was my life. In the beginning, I had a toddler, and my children were in college so it didn't seem like it was very rapid at all. But I imagine someone looking back would say it was rapid. So hindsight would change our notion of rapidity. Let's look at rituals that emerge in the state of Israel after its founding. I think that happened pretty quickly. Post 48, certainly kibbutzim were creating new Passover Haggadot, Passover books for their Seders. Very, very quickly, new holidays for marking independence, for marking tragedies. I think that was a period of fairly rapid innovation. If we go far, far back, what we learn in Hebrew school, and maybe even in our Jewish history classes, is that after the destruction of the temple, poof, we move from temple Judaism to rabbinic Judaism, like overnight. But that took even longer than the response to feminist change. We describe it as if it were overnight, and a bunch of rabbis sitting together came up with dandy ideas for new ways to pray, new ways to have alternatives to sacrifice, new ways to have the home be the mikdash ma'at, have your home be an alternative to the temple as the sacred place. That took a long, long time. I don't think we can use that anymore as the gold standard of rapid change. Our mutual friend, Rabbi B'nai Lappe, speaks of that period as a crash, and there was change after that crash. And you think, well, after a car crash, quick, the tow truck comes and you get a rental car and you handle the crash immediately. But the response to that Jewish crash of the destruction of the temple, that was long and gradual. And I'd say we only think of it as being cohesive when we look backwards.
Yeah, I mean, I've been seeing some memes lately where kids currently growing up are writing about, quote unquote, the 1900s. And all these professors are like, oh my gosh, what's happening? They're talking about the 1900s. That tension is what you're talking about. Like, to somebody like me who was born in 1990, it feels like icky to be like, oh, us and the 1910s. Oh, that's all one thing called the 1900s. But it's without a doubt the case that, like, in a few hundred years, forget in 1,000 years, in a few hundred years, there's not going to be much of an ability for somebody to really feel in their bones the difference between the end of the 1900s and the beginning. Like, if somebody were to seriously say, like, Lex, do you have the ability to parse out the differences between, like, the late 1600s and the early? No, I don't. Like, I can say a couple tiny things about that time period. But anyway, I love that point you're bringing about rapidity. The question I want to ask is less about time and more about things. I actually love talking about stuff with you. And both of those words, things, stuff, they feel trivializing. We often trivialize things that are tangible and material. But whenever I'm engaged in conversation with Jews about what we might term more fancily material culture, which is to say stuff, I think of you. And flashing back to our first conversation, and it's because you've deeply influenced my own thinking on this, like flashing to our first conversation with you, I love the way that you talk about sort of what makes an object Jewish and how you push back on historic understandings of how we might consider an object Jewish or not Jewish. I've actually, for many years since that conversation, done an exercise in Zoom. Whenever I need like a 5-minute time filler, I'll say to everyone, find something in your house right now that's a Jewish object to you, but that somebody else couldn't tell is a Jewish object. Because you shine a light on all these ways in which an object being Jewish doesn't mean it's a mezuzah necessarily. It doesn't mean it's a yarmulke necessarily. It could also be Jewishly ascribed in other ways. So can you bring our listeners a little taste of that? Because it's changed my life.
Absolutely. I'm really honored and glad to hear that, Lex. As a matter of fact, the exercise of looking around your home and finding objects that are obviously Jewish and objects that you know are Jewish because you know it in your gut, but no one else would necessarily know that. That's the first exercise that we're going to be doing, because I when I teach it to students, I always do it myself and get to re-see my environment. Let me talk about one Jewish material object, and hopefully it will answer some of the broader questions that you've raised. A computer or an iPad or a cell phone. Before COVID, all three were the thing that I would not do, well, I would not engage with on a Jewish holy day. Comes COVID, and what do I do with my computer when it's our first Passover Seder all on our own? Would I turn it on? Would I not turn it on? And of course I was going to turn it on. There were many rabbis who said, yes, you can, yes, you may. But that wasn't my interest. My interest was this gut feeling in my heart of what would it mean to be, for us to be by ourselves, for my mother to be by herself, for my kids to be by themselves. That first Zoom Seder happened on the screen of my computer, the very one I'm looking at right now. And it was really the first time that I saw a computer screen as not something that one would avoid on a Jewish holy day, but an object that gave me access to the beautiful faces and the beautiful voices of my family members. I could hear voices quavering, or I could see tears in eyes when people would talk about the challenges of this Seder alone, or their incredible gratitude that they felt for healthcare professionals who are taking such risks. And so it became a holy object. It remained a holy object when I would go online to go to B'nai Jeshurun every Shabbat. But there were more objects that coalesced around it. There would be my couch. where I would cozy up with a blanket if it was cold, and the cup of coffee, and the prayer book that I had ready to use, but I probably never used it. I just held it. I held it near me for Shabbat morning services during COVID. My computer was part of this constellation of objects that created the possibility of having a beautiful spiritual communal Shabbat, even though I was still in my home. And I can even add my garden to the mix, because when the rabbis at BJ or whatever synagogue I was visiting that day would say, well, now it's time to say the Amidah, the silent blessing. You can stand, you can sit, you can stand if you are able. And I think, well, I'm going to just go outside, which is something you can't do when you're at synagogue. During the time that was allocated to the Amidah, I would walk outside and look at what was coming up and look at the seedlings and touch them. I would try my very best not to weed, but I would be part of my garden. And then I checked my watch, which then became also part of the religious experience, the timekeeping. And I'd come back inside and I'd be with my computer and my online community. And this became Shabbat, this mingling of inside and outside, the virtual, and my husband was in the house with me, so he was my non-virtual element. And neither of us was dressed in proper Shabbat clothes. So our regular, everyday Saturday morning clothes became a new Shabbat garb. In order for it all to work, I think we had to use a Jewish term, which my rabbinic colleagues were using, which is Sha'at Hadchak, a time of emergency, a time that requires unusual and strong and speedy responses. If I can add one more, we used as a material object the capabilities of Zoom. Some of you have probably been to an online bat mitzvah or an online bar mitzvah, and you'll see in the chat room, this is when kids, the only person in the synagogue was the kid and the rabbi and the parents. The chat room would be filled with comments from friends and relatives going, "You go, girl. You kill the Haftorah. It's so great to be together." And you would be watching the transpiring of the event, but then the chat room itself would be a way of creating community, which reminded me of the fact that all of us whisper who go to synagogue. We all whisper, or we walk outside and we chit-chat. But this was a way for us to have a communal whisper and a communal way of showing support. It was empowering to people who otherwise don't feel empowered in Jewish space, and creative and funky at the same time.
That's really, really powerful. I regularly talk about the chat as the Gemara, which is a term from like the Talmud. There's Mishnah, which is seen as the first part of a two-part thing, the Talmud. And then there's the Gemara, which is all of people's musings and extended commentary on the Mishnah. And I call the chat box in Zoom the Gemara for multiple reasons. One, just like the Talmud goes off topic and is not always related to the Mishnah, the chat box can also do that, but in a way that I find elevates the role of everybody in the room. Not only, there's what the bat mitzvah girl receives from being told, "You go, girl," and there's also the way in which every participant in that room, by understanding that their words can be visible, they actually are not just a receiver. They are a giver to the space. I don't know that they process that, but it comes through subconsciously, and it creates a kind of ritual space that is actually thoroughly different from when you're all in rows facing a direction and receiving something from folks separate from you. It totally transforms the space. So that's really, really powerful. I want to go another direction. I love being able to find new Jewish meaning in objects that we haven't seen as Jewish, things like computer screens, things like our garden, like our homes, like our garb on Saturday morning, which might be a bathrobe, whatever it might be. I love that. I find that Jews often have a really deep relationship to the flow of time. Even folks who don't necessarily go to synagogue every week, sometimes especially, there's this sense of the flow of the year, and certain moments, especially Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Hanukkah, Passover, highlight moments that feel just like Jewish times of year. And then there's moments like now, as we release this, January. I'm curious your wisdom around what it means, what it looks like to Jewify, to Judaicize, to find Jewish meaning in moments that are not necessarily the obvious Jewish ones in the same way we do that with objects that don't look to others to be Jewish.
One of the ways that we create Jewish time beyond the holidays is when we think of the private events of our lives in Jewish ways. So, for instance, when we're marking the death of a loved one, or we're marking birthdays, where we're marking graduations and so forth, or going to college for the first time. Any of the events that happen in our lives have potential Jewish responses to them. They may be, some might say, well, that's wackadoodle. But I think we can choose to use all the elements of what I've always called the Jewish toolkit: Jewish rituals, Jewish liturgies, including Hebrew language prayers and Jewish literature in whatever language we speak, Jewish ideas, big ideas that inform us, Jewish sensibilities, I might call those. We can bring all of that to the stuff of every day. My other response reminds me of my grandma Sally, who started wishing us Shabbat Shalom on Wednesday. And then we got Gut Woch, have a good week, Saturday night, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Every day was a day in relationship to the upcoming Sabbath. My colleague David Kramer at the Jewish Theological Seminary used to say whenever he would go to the market, he would see an item, think, oh, how could I possibly use that on Shabbat? Or would that avocado be ripe on Shabbat? And I must say that that's how I make it through my weeks. I'm reflecting on how the last Shabbat was. And then I'm thinking about, who do I want to be with? What am I going to do? What am I going to cook? What do I want to study? As a matter of fact, my learning for the whole week is based on the upcoming Torah portion of the week to come. This may be just my own proclivity, but I'm always in relationship to Shabbat. I think there are more and more people thinking about Shabbat time. I think of the incredible success of the organization called One Table, which has young folks who are learning how to gather together for Shabbat. And in order to gather on Shabbat, they have to start preparing quite early.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm reflecting as you're having this conversation. I've been teaching a class in the Yeshiva as well, an introduction to Judaism class for people that are considering converting to Judaism, among other people that can be in the class. And one of the things that I do is walk them through the evolution of the Jewish calendar. And when you look at the Jewish calendar in the Bible, they're basically 3 holidays: Sukkot, Passover, and Shavuot. Then I have these slides, and you start to see the years in a circle, and these holidays, right? Passover and Sukkot are exactly 6 months apart, and Passover and Shavuot are exactly 7 weeks apart. And so you see on the sort of top side, the quote summer side of the calendar, it's still actually pretty sparse, but on the kind of winter side of the calendar, there's absolutely nothing. And then you look at how that evolves over time, and it starts to fill in a little bit. So on the kind of winter side, you see Purim and Hanukkah appear. And then, okay, so then there's some balance. But then over time, it gets fuller and fuller and fuller and fuller. And I'm wondering whether one of the reasons that we have added so many holidays over the centuries is that maybe that Lex's question, how do you make a Tuesday afternoon Jewish, becomes somehow less and less feasible for people. They lose the capacity to do that. And so the only way to make something feel like a Jewish thing is to actually make it a Jewish thing, like turn it into a holiday or turn it into Shabbat. And I wonder a little bit about going back in the opposite direction. And I'm curious what scholarship tells us about the de-invention of Jewish ritual. Could we imagine a reduction, for example, of Jewish holidays because Shabbat may become more prominent because of One Table? Or could we imagine a world where people don't need these high experiences of Judaism in the same way because they have somehow been successful, or we have been successful at helping people integrate it more into their day-to-day lives? And if so, I mean, maybe the answer is that the de-invention of ritual just doesn't happen in human history and it's a one-way ratchet. And then I wonder about the human capacity to just have so many holidays. But if there is the capacity to kind of do a reduction of ritual, how is that done in a thoughtful way? How can people say, hey, this is too much for me. but I really want to have powerful Jewish rituals in my life. How might I choose a relatively smaller number and figure out how to do that in a powerful way?
I think the response to your question, Dan, which is a very challenging question, really depends on what community you come from. If you are a secular Jew who checks in on holidays once in a while, you have a kind of freedom to say, well, I'm not doing Purim this year. I'm just going to skip Tu B'Shvat. There's a kind of freedom. If you're in a more traditional community where these holidays become markers of your belonging, if you're caught not doing it, then there's the risk of feeling a certain amount of shame. It's a touchy matter. Holidays go in and out of fashion. I remember reading, I believe it was in the work of Mordechai Kaplan, his describing that in the 40s and the 50s, before Hanukkah became a holiday of children, that Hanukkah, Kaplan said, had fallen into desuetude. I don't know how to spell desuetude, but I once knew, and I looked it up. It's my biggest word. And it means that something has fallen out of use. And when we think of Hanukkah now, it's such a big deal. Even Trader Joe's has a whole selection of Hanukkah cards. It's hard to imagine that lighting menorah was something that many American Jews, unless they were quite traditional, were simply not doing until there were presents and little books for children and so forth. So I imagine that, yes, it is possible, even in our day and age, considering for Lex, who was born in the 1900s, so he can relate to something that happened in the 1940s and 50s quite easily, as if he were there.
Of course.
That, the idea that Hanukkah was about to fall off the mat, that makes sense. I love that there are lots of holidays, because I think we do pick and choose, and we have our favorites, and we pick the ones that allow us to be most expressive. Because I don't feel any compunction about skipping something, say, a particular fast day. Since I can't fast, I never feel sad about not observing fast days. I suppose our lives can always be so mundane that having the opportunity to check in with the history of our tradition, or if the particular holiday annoys me, I like to get annoyed and I like to fight against it.
Yes.
It's like, no, I don't do that. And that's why I don't do that. And having a second, say, the kind of person who thinks, I don't like the idea that there are 2 days, and have a lot of good reasons why they don't. I love that. I love challenging the calendar.
Yes. So that's such a great and important point. I mean, to do a Jewish action is not the same thing as to affirm an inherited Jewish ritual or a Jewish holiday. Like, it is equally a Jewish action to read a text that is from the Bible and love it, and to read a text from the Bible and despise it. Like, both of those are Jewish actions that happened if a Jew does them and sees them Jewishly, right? Like, having a holiday be an annual moment to be like, ugh, why do we do this? The 2-day holiday thing is great. I mean, one of my favorite days of the year is, quote unquote, for me, the 8th day of Passover. I strongly believe that Passover should be 7 days. I think Sukkot should be 7 days. That's what they were in. If we're talking about biblical calendar, it's Sukkot's more complicated, but Passover is clearly 7 days. And I think that that's actually part of the point. I think it's a hyperlink to other sevens, to creation, to the Shemitah year, which is the 7th year. There's a lot that matters on the 7th. And so the 8th day every year is one of my most agitated years. But I'm also kind of thrilled because I'm eating my bread before other people are. And I don't feel like I'm breaking any rules because I don't think the holiday's still happening. But that's actually lighting me up Jewishly, eating bread. Let's forget challah. Eating a piece of rye, that's still Jewy coded. Eating a piece of wheat on the 8th day of Passover feels like a Jewish action to me in a way that it won't on a random other day of the year. So that really speaks to me. The question I have, though, relates to the holidays in and out of style. And I'll ask briefly, but you can mention Hanukkah, and I think people know in the back of their mind, yeah, Hanukkah's become more popular. Some holidays rise and fall. But we cannot overstate how thoroughly this stuff fluctuates. 130 years ago, Shavuot was one of the preeminent holidays of the American Jewish calendar. Laura Yaris's work is incredible on this front. Shavuot was a massive occasion with huge amounts of local budget lines going into massive flower displays in synagogues. It was a huge deal. Shavuot became, what was the word? Shavuot fell into desuetude.
Desuetude.
Take your century, like pick a century, and the big quote unquote major quote unquote holidays are different. And so I'd love to hear more from you about that. Like, that's not just an interesting fact. Like, that permits us to actually have some agency over which holidays we might make more and less important.
I'm thinking about what were some of the factors that made Shavuot less important. And certainly in the Reform movement, when it became non-transgressive to have a bar or bat mitzvah, when it was no longer seen as an Orientalist practice, where children were learning Hebrew and they were learning the blessings and so forth, it no longer became necessary to have a day of a coming out kind of day of Shavuot, of this confirmation and reform communities, because there had been this attention lavished on each individual child for their bar or bat mitzvah. So Shavuot became less important.
But what's really interesting is that the Shavuot that became less important was itself an innovation on Shavuot, right? Because the traditional Shavuot has nothing to do with teenagers and whatever confirmation, however we describe that. Anyway, the original Shavuot, I mean, the original Shavuot was about bringing a certain set of sacrifices, fruits to the first fruits to the temple. But then it evolved into this holiday that was much more about remembering when the Torah was given, and the Kabbalists turned that into all-night studying, and so. It's also interesting to reflect on the way that quote unquote saving of a holiday or reinvention of a holiday could actually lead to the death of that holiday, right? So it may be that the embrace of the reform movement of Shavuot, but giving it a certain valence that had to do with teenagers, meant that once that need was no longer present, the holiday fell into disuse, whatever you said, desuetude, because people had forgotten the old meanings of the holiday, because the innovation had been around long enough that people forgot the old ideas. And so when those new ideas went away, it seemed like, oh, there's no more point to this holiday. And it makes me think about Hanukkah, in that right now we're living in the time of the triumph of Hanukkah, right? We're living in the time of Hanukkah is the biggest holiday, but it's the biggest holiday for a certain set of reasons that you could imagine if they went away, Hanukkah would be completely forgotten again.
So I want to challenge you on that one, Dan. I think the biggest Jewish holiday these days is not Hanukkah anymore. I think it's Passover. I've never met a non-Jewish person who said, I really want to celebrate Hanukkah. I've never heard that. But I have many non-Jewish friends who could not imagine a Passover going by without an invitation to someone's Seder. You got to be at Seder. And I think because people have been feeling free to invent their own Haggadahs or free to celebrate Passover in a way that's meaningful to them, which could be meeting together with friends or family sometime during the week of Passover or just before Passover or just after, and having Passover inflected foods and telling some story or using the event to affirm a social justice practice or a political sensibility. I think that has become big. If I think about COVID, it's like, how are we going to mark Passover if we can't be together? I don't recall that many people saying, what are we going to do for Hanukkah? So I think there may be a shift. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the Jewish high holidays, I know lots of people show up, but I don't think that they are as compelling as Passover, which takes place in the home, which doesn't require a rabbi, and lets people be eccentric, idiosyncratic, and expressive all at once.
Yeah. I'm really fascinated in sitting with the point you made about folks not saying, oh, I really wish I could celebrate Hanukkah. There's like a whirlwind of possibilities undergirding that. I do think there's one axis of ritual that it points to, which Hanukkah, the core ritual action, lighting a menorah, I think is read as a religious action and a Jewishly religious action. Passover Seder, like, going around the table and reading a story, people are both honored as non-Jews to be invited to that, and many Jews want to share that with others. it just points to this interesting set of questions about how we conceptualize certain holidays as more for Jews or for Jews and others. A lot of Seders have people there who are not Jewish. And look, I think that's true for Hanukkah too. There's lots of interfaith families who, even when they light the candles themselves, it is an interfaith gathering. And when synagogues do their Hanukkah lighting, it's more likely to be like, this is for our members, and like, yeah, we'll make latkes and bring them to work. We'll bring them to the public school and like share latkes and like mention the rituals of the holiday. But it's rare that we actually do the rituals with other groups. I'm curious if you can talk a little about the Jewish, not Jewish axis of ritual participation.
Thinking about what has Hanukkah come to mean in the public sphere. It's become, when you see a menorah, it's like, we're there too. We're there at the mall. We're there downtown. We count. We're not, what are we, chopped liver? We belong in America. Our practice matters, which, if you think about it, is that connected to any of the deep themes of Hanukkah? I mean, you could talk about a kind of nationalistic or tribal triumphalism that Hanukkah reflects. But I think that sense of we're here and we count is in some ways far from some of the earlier themes of Hanukkah, the theme of miracles or the theme of a military victory. And perhaps this theme of we're here is the one that has taken hold in our time, because miracles don't seem to happen anymore, and because we're gravely concerned about the notion of Jewish military victories. If I think about non-Jews and Jews participating in our holidays, Passover is the one, unlike Rosh Hashanah, unlike Yom Kippur, it's one that doesn't require any kind of, it doesn't require special skills. You don't have to belong. I mean, literally, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you have to belong. If you want to go to a synagogue, you need to belong. It's for members. Since I've lived in Charlottesville, Virginia for so many years, a place where there aren't that many Jews, all of my celebrations of Jewish time have always included non-Jews. So for me to have a Rosh Hashanah, we have a Rosh Hashanah Seder, a play on the Passover Seder for Rosh Hashanah. It's always been the time when I would invite my new colleagues from the university, no matter what their backgrounds were. And it was a way that we would begin the new year together with wishes of sweetness. And I felt, because I'm a cheerleader for all things Jewish, I thought, well, why not share my Jewish joy and the Jewish opportunities for being anxious about a new year and replacing anxiety with hopefulness.
Well, I was thinking about this question initially because we were talking about the problematics of military victories. But when my son was very young, he famously was sitting in the car with my wife and said to her, Mom, I know that the bad guy for Hanukkah is Antiochus, and the bad guy for Purim is Haman, and the bad guy for Passover is Pharaoh. But who's the bad guy for Shabbat? And
that's amazing.
It's a great story. But I think that what he was like fundamentally revealing there in some of the language that we're talking about is that what he needed at his age was holidays, Judaism to be about bad guys, about defeating bad guys. That spoke to him. That somehow answered a certain need that he had. And we can think about our needs changing over the course of our life. As we get older, I think actually, right, I start to become more attracted to a holiday like Shabbat, specifically because it doesn't have bad guys. It's more about reflection and rest and these kind of things that I think are not very appealing to a 3-year-old.
But wait, Dan, there is a bad guy of Shabbat.
Who is it?
Well, Shabbat is, if we call it holy time and holy place, the bad guy is non-holiness. And Shabbat is the rejection of the non-special and the non-reflective. The bad guy is rote. The bad guy is the way you would feel that if someone on Shabbat asked you to sign your lease or to take out the garbage.
I'm wondering how this answer would have gone over with my son.
Yeah, not so well.
For the record, I'm not sure that it shows he needed bad guys. I think it shows that he had been taught to conceptualize that holidays have bad guys, and that's like an interesting set of things that are affected.
I think that's right, but I also think that it spoke to him. It was something that felt like, that makes sense. That's something that we should celebrate. We defeated the bad guys. That might be a more expansive idea that what, he's watching cartoons or whatever, the other parts of his life were about, that this kind of spoke to him. But my deeper question is this thing that you raised at the beginning, Vanessa, about needs. As we think about ritual invention and reinvention, a question arises, are there new needs that human beings have in 21st century America or other places in the world that perhaps they didn't have, or they didn't have in the same way in the past? And some of those are easier to identify, like COVID. I mean, there are obviously a set of needs that emerged during COVID. We were cut off from the people that we loved. So we had a need for community in a new way that current rituals and current structures were not able to meet those needs. I'm wondering, as you think about the examples of deep needs that you've seen your students have, where they maybe say, yeah, and I just don't find that Judaism meets those needs, and that you say, oh, but it could, here's what you would have to do in order to. So what are some of those needs that seem most prevalent to you?
I think virtual Judaism, we used to have a notion about online religion being useful, whatever religion it was. It was a way that we could access religious stuff, but our real religion wasn't happening online, because in order for religion to happen, you needed palpable in-person community. COVID practices, they showed us that we could have real religion online. On occasion, I lead the Kaddish minyan for my Jewish learning, which meets most days of the week. And when I say Kaddish with those people, they're my people. Even if I don't know them, when I see the names in the chat room of the people they're mourning that day, either because they've just become mourners or they're remembering them on the yearly anniversary, I'm saying those names and I'm connecting to them, and I'm sending my prayers to the people who've departed and the ones who are there remembering them. This is brand new for me. That is a really deep need for spirituality that our virtual religious platforms have met. I think because of COVID, we all developed a greater hunger for Jewish learning. The Judaism Unbound podcasts and the Unyeshiva classes, and so much that's now available online. I think of the daily meditation set of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, coming together and being Jewish and learning Jewish, observing Jewish, having Shabbat together. Our spiritual needs are being met in brand new ways. These experiences, I don't think the people who are having them would say they are less than. So let me celebrate the ways that new needs have been met. Post October 7th is a very different story, and our hearts were broken. We needed to find ways to respond, to share our anguish, and we needed to answer the question, how can we possibly observe a festive holiday, or a holiday that focuses on liberation, knowing what's going on in Israel, knowing what's going on in Gaza? And I think that those, in some ways, are the pressing rituals ahead of us. How do we continue to do the same old, given the kind of unrest, not just in the Middle East, but what many of us feel is going on in the United States at this moment, the kind of fear that we feel, say, for refugees, the kind of fear we feel for women to have autonomy over our bodies. I have a feeling that new Jewish ritual responses are going to continue to emerge. So things that we took for granted, like there would be in Jewish day schools, there would always be an Israel Independence Day celebration. Well, what does it mean if children are sort of mindlessly waving Israeli flags? What does that mean that they've learned about Israel? Can you just take out a flag and serve some falafel at your Hebrew school or your day school and call it a day? I think we have to be far more reflexive about how we show who we are and what we believe.
So I have a question on a different front, and it relates to the specific ritual tools we might be able to mobilize when we combine things that sort of live in the scholarly realm, in academia, in intellect and intellectual, whatever term we want to use there, with that which is generally talked about as like Jewish tradition. What I see as one of your superpowers is that you are a Jewish studies professor who does not feel any kind of baggage about hosting a Rosh Hashanah Seder or a Passover Seder. There's plenty of professors. I think this is becoming less of a trend now, but like historically, a lot of people in Jewish studies departments doing work in religious studies wanted to make it really clear, no, I'm not a practitioner. I am learning about it, studying it. There's actually Jews that want davkas. They want exactly precisely the kinds of Jewish rituals that feel both anchored in history and like thoughtful and grounded in what we might call academic, and that moves their hearts. And when we don't allow ourselves to bridge those, we actually sort of stifle the whole ecosystem by forcing everyone to either be in quote unquote spiritual spaces, or on the other hand, to be like a geek who likes learning about Jewish studies. I love bridging them, and I think you've found ways to do that as a scholar rabbi, a professor rabbi. I hear ranter for Rabbi Cantor. I haven't yet heard profabi, but I kind of want to make it a thing. But I think that there's like really juicy things that arise when we allow ourselves to blend the magic of academia with Jewish experience and vice versa. So why might it be worthwhile, beneficial for more of us to follow your lead and do that as we bring the academic into our Jewish practices and vice versa?
I've always thought that in order to observe any Jewish practice, you need to know so much. So I've always thought of any practitioner of Judaism as a backseat Jewish studies professor. You just need to learn so much.
Listeners, Vanessa's giving you tenure.
And I also think since the 1970s or 80s or 90s, when so much Jewish knowledge became easily accessible, the way that you can, on Judaism Unbound, one can learn so much stuff about Judaism. You don't have to be a professor. You don't have to be enrolled in a course or My Jewish Learning. There's so many platforms for learning Jewish stuff. It struck me that one of the great gifts of, say, the Jewish catalog era, the do-it-yourself Judaism era, and now the easily accessed Judaism of Judaism Unbound, of My Jewish Learning, of Sefaria, it strikes me that anyone can learn pretty much what Jewish studies professors know. And you can learn it. You can learn it in English. You can learn it in English translation. I think there's a huge hunger to know more about why Jews do what we do, to learn our texts, and to know that we can actually access that material without the intervention of a rabbi. We can all become backseat Jewish studies professors. We can master what we need to master. When I perform lots of interfaith weddings ever since I was ordained as a rabbi, it's my great joy. It's something I love to do. And the first thing I do when I meet with a couple is I say, okay, you have homework now. You're going to have to read a book by Anita Diamond called The Jewish Wedding, the Jewish Wedding Now, or The New Jewish Wedding. She keeps revising it. There's always a new.
I recommend the same book.
But since no one reads anymore, since COVID, no one can read. So books. So I say, okay, well, go to My Jewish Learning, or go to a podcast, or go to the posh British website called Smashing. I think it's called Smash the Glass or Smashing the Glass, where they have a good Jewish Weddings 101.
I should say, by the way, The Jewish Wedding Now, I think, is now available as an audiobook, so maybe people could listen to it.
They'll listen, thank goodness. And so before our next session, they have learned a lot about the history of Jewish wedding rituals. I mean, when I got married, it's like, do this, do that, march here, say this, stick out your finger. You're going to be standing under something. I didn't know what the history of the chuppah was. But my wedding couples, the Jews, the non-Jews, they know this stuff. And I have this great feeling of satisfaction that they are not just puppets on that day. And I think that's been a great transformation in ritual practice in our time. Jewish people no longer have to be puppets. Learn what's necessary. I mean, Jewish study, you speak about Jewish studies professors, we're sort of divided. There are those who are vehemently secular, and then there are many of us who know how to do the choreography of having our personal private allegiances and practices, and separating them in some ways from what goes on in the classroom. I would say I'm a little bit quirky because while I know how to do that, my students also know that they can come talk to me in my office, and I have no problem talking about my personal practices. While I wouldn't want to be a spiritual director or advisor for a student during a course, I think it's a little bit messy. I think there's some fungibility there.
So this has been so wonderful. As we close, just folks have heard your wisdom in this episode, and I encourage them to go back and listen to your 2 previous appearances as well. Give us just a little sneak preview about some of the magic that's going to be unlocked in these 3 classes. Some of the things we talked about today are going to infuse their way in, absolutely. But what's the flow going to be like? Why should people immediately run to judaismunbound.com/classes and sign up?
Thank you for this opportunity to share this class that I'm so excited about. I'm really excited about, in particular, about being one of a community of Jewish ritual creators. I think we all have the ability. I don't think we have to know anything in advance. As I just said a moment ago, I want people to have the opportunity to think about Jewish ritual in new ways. It's not just the stuff that's out there. Jewish rituals are practices that we can shape and create to meet our very real needs, human needs, spiritual needs. So as I mentioned before, the first session will be about looking at Jewish objects. In particular, we'll look at Jewish objects in our home by doing an ethnography exercise and creating a little Jewish mini museum. And it will give folks an opportunity to have a sort of a radical shift in thinking about what counts as Jewish and how do we create Jewish space. So we'll start with space and things. Our next session will be looking at the site of tremendous ritual innovation in our era, which has begun and continues to unfold. We'll be looking at Passover ritual as it has existed so far. So there'll be a certain amount of history there. How did the orange get there? Why do we have Miriam's cup? Why do we have a Miriam's tambourine on the table? Why do we have a brand new Haggadah every single year? And why do we need a new one for this year? So what does it mean to innovate? What kinds of innovations are authentic? And I'll be very quick to bash the notion of authenticity as being something that's a fact. And then our final session will be an opportunity to be inspired by rituals and practices of the secular world and of other traditions. There's a wonderful exercise by the late Harvard professor Krister Stendhal of thinking about what makes you jealous, envious of other religions. What's wonderful about it is it helps us think about what do we feel absent in our own practices, and how can we look around us and be inspired? Jews have always been looking outside for good ideas. I mean, the Hanukkah present is a Christmas present differently wrapped. It will be a very liberating experience, I trust. We'll be able to think about our Jewish practices with wholly other possibilities.
Thank you so much, Vanessa Ochs, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much, Lex, and thank you so much, Dan. It's great to be talking with you both again and thinking aloud.
We love thinking out loud with you. Thanks so much, Vanessa Ochs, for joining us, and thanks to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As a reminder, judaismunbound.com/classes. You've heard it today. You've heard it in recent episodes if you've listened to those as well. It's the place to go. judaismunbound.com/classes. Register for Vanessa Ochs' amazing 3-week mini course, Jewish Ritual Lab. You can also see our other mini courses. They've started already, but you've only missed one class if you're hearing this the week that this episode comes out. So you can still register, watch the recording of the first one for those other classes, and then be there for the final 2 in real time. Head to our website, sign up. Financial aid is available. We hope that you will dive into the Onion Yeshiva. As we close, we also encourage you to be in touch with us with any ideas, visions, questions, criticisms, whatever you got. You can be in touch in any of the following ways. First, there's our social media handles. Facebook and Instagram are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and all sorts of other goodies. Third, there are our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We're also greatly appreciative for those who are able to make a financial donation on either a monthly recurring basis or just via a one-time gift at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.